Chapter 1281. But she didn't. Sandy's pregnancy was like a ticking time bomb that exploded right next to me and caught me off guard. On one side, it was the ex who I couldn't get my mind off and was pregnant with my child. On the other, it was the woman who wanted to marry me. I really didn't know what to do. Whenever I saw Sandy cry, I would always think of Pearl. Pearl has never cried, and I've never seen her cry or show her fragile side to me ever since I got to know her. When the engagement was cancelled, and she moved out of the apartment, I couldn't control my urge any longer and defiled her while I was drunk. I finally got my hands on the woman that I once despised. She isn't as bad as I thought, and it wasn't that she couldn't or wouldn't cry. It was just that she didn't care. It hurts me deep down when I see her crying. That's why I didn't want to see her cry. It's undeniable that I have feelings for Pearl. Perhaps I was already tempted from the moment I started paying attention to her, or from the moment I felt a little strange about her deep down. After learning that Sandy had framed Pearl for her miscarriage, and then the truth that she had once borrowed money from loan sharks, it became clearer and clearer to me that what I loved was the Sandy that I knew in the past, and what I couldn't let go of was the beautiful emotions and memories that we had created in the past. And when the flaws of the near-perfect person who gave me all those memories appeared, it became clear to me that everything was just an illusion, and the bubble formed by the memories I shared with Sandy popped in an instant. I couldn't accept Sandy's true colors, however, I could accept Pearl, whose past was even more unbearable than Sandy's. Was it because Sandy had changed? In fact, it was not. It was only because of the change in my perspective. I was the one who had changed. If Sandy hadn't chosen to commit suicide because she couldn't accept that I'd fallen in love with Pearl, I would have confessed everything to her. However, Sandy's death was unacceptable to me. How could I still fall in love with Pearl like nothing's happened after Sandy just died because of this? Even if I do love her, I can't do it. Sandy committed suicide because I fell in love with Pearl. That's why I've attributed all the mistakes to Pearl. If she hadn't appeared in my life, causing me to fall in love with her, none of that would have happened. But all those are just excuses for me to escape reality. I didn't want to admit I was in love with an unbearable woman. Tanner took Pearl into his arms abruptly, and Pearl was stunned. He tightened his hug as if he was afraid that she would disappear instantly. I've let one woman in my life down, and I've hurt another one. I already can't make it up to the woman I let down, but I want to apologize to the woman I hurt. I wanted to tell her that I've fallen in love with her, but she no longer remembers me anymore. Pearl was trapped in his arms, and while she was listening to his trembling apology, a drop of tear rolled down her cheek inexplicably. Time passed by day after day, and it was already Christmas in the blink of an eye. Maisie saw the two children decorating the house with bells and whistles. As soon as she stepped into the Goldman mansion, she covered her face with her palm. Daisy, Colton, must it be so exaggerated? Daisy climbed down from the ladder. We decorated our classroom and school, just like this last Christmas, so how is this an exaggeration? Maisie felt extremely speechless and helpless. The whole mansion is covered in all the colors that can be found in a color palette, so how is this not an exaggeration? Sure enough, I just can't understand the kids' aesthetics. Daisy walked up to her, jerked the hem of her clothes, and asked, "Mom, can I invite a classmate over to our house to play on Christmas?" Maisie paused and replied with a smile, "Of course, you can decide for yourself when it comes to inviting your classmates." Daisy nodded. Colton, who was still arranging flowers by the side, clicked his tongue. "You must have invited that boy, haven't you? I don't understand what's so good about him. He's a feeble boy and sissier than no lace." Chapter 1282. Colton. Maisie wanted to stop him, but it was already too late. He could have mentioned anyone, but he mentioned Nolace instead. Sure enough, when Daisy heard Nolace's name, her delighted face dimmed in an instant. Colton realized that he had misspoken and scratched his head. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Just invite whoever you want." "I'm not." Before he could finish speaking, Daisy had already sprinted upstairs, and the slamming of a door followed the series of footsteps. Maisie glanced at Colton, and the latter pouted. "I didn't mean it." Maisie patted his head. "Go and comfort your sister." "I know." Colton put down the flower in her hand and followed Daisy upstairs. He came to Daisy's room and knocked on the door. "Daisy, it was all my fault, and I'm apologizing to you now. So please open the door." Daisy, who was standing downstairs, heard Colton's voice and could not help but chuckle. Colton can be disagreeable and critical from time to time, but he does so only because of his love for his sister, and this kiddo sounds just like his father when he apologizes. Daisy had always been a pure and headstrong girl. She had gotten very used to being coaxed by her brother. Thus, her temper subsided quickly as soon as her brother apologized. She responded from the inside of the room. "I heard you. You're so long-winded." Colton crossed his arms and leaned against the door. "So, are you still angry?" She replied loudly, "Of course, I'm still angry. The only way to relieve my anger is to give me 10 presents tonight." The corner of Colton's lips twitched. All right, 10 presents it is then. Sigh, raising a little sister is really not an easy task. At noon, Barbara came to visit with her child. Beatrice was already half a year old. Although she was still babbling, she looked much bigger in size than when she was 2 months old. Daisy and Colton carried Beatrice and brought her along to play in the courtyard. Maisie sat in the pavilion and drank tea with Barbara. Barbara exclaimed, "Christmas is quite lively for the kids, huh?" Maisie responded helplessly, "Because it's the time of the year when they get presents. Daisy is the happiest when it's time to receive gifts." Barbara took a sip of tea and thought of something. "Have you seen Pearl since she lost her memory?" Maisie shook her head, picked up the teapot, and poured tea for both of them. "Perhaps amnesia is a good thing for her. It's sometimes a blessing to be able to forget about unpleasant incidents. Me getting to see her or not is no longer an important matter." Barbara said with a smile, "I just don't know what will happen when she regains her memory. Her life might have already been filled with good memories before she remembers the bad ones, so no matter how painful they are, they will be buffered. It depends on whether she'll accept them after remembering them." Maisie was referring to Pearl and Tanner. After learning that Pearl had lost her memory, Tanner had been approaching her as a friend. Maybe he was trying to get her to accept him again and to make up for the mistakes that he had made. However, despite wanting to make up for it, the damage had already been done. Pear would not have lost her memory if it were not because of the despair she had gone through. Thus, Tanner's efforts to be kind to her and to make it up for her would be at her mercy, because everything would still depend on whether she could accept him again once her memory was restored. In the evening, the children started to get busy, helping to arrange the barbecue dinner in the yard. The butler asked the servants to help set the table, and there were various delicacies, snacks, drinks, and other foods on the table. A Mercedes-Benz was parked outside the gate of the Goldman mansion. Daisy saw the person who got out of the car and ran over with a wide grin. "Zafir, you've come." Zafir smiled and handed her a Christmas present that he had prepared. "Merry Christmas, Daisy." "Thank you, Zafir." Daisy responded with a smile and grabbed Zafir's hand. "Come in, come with me." Zafir looked back at the bodyguard in the car and said, "Come pick me up at night." Chapter 1283. The bodyguard nodded and drove away. "Mom." Daisy took Zafir to Maisie's side and introduced him to her. "Mom, this is Zafir, the friend I've been mentioning to you." Zafir greeted her politely, "Hello, Mrs. Goldman. I study in the same school as Daisy. I'm currently in the 6th grade, and my name is Zafir Gosling." Maisie laughed. "It's nice to meet you, Zafir. This boy seems very humble and polite." She then glanced at Daisy. "You're in charge of your friend tonight. You have to entertain your guest well." Daisy nodded. "I know, Mom, I'll definitely try my best to entertain him." After Daisy took Zafir away, Barbara came over with Beatrice in her arms. "Your daughter is quite popular among boys, huh?" Not to mention, as far as Daisy's appearance was concerned, she was already very pretty looking at the age of 9. She would definitely look breathtaking in another few years' time. Maisie rubbed her temples. Yeah, this is the pain in my ass right now. After becoming a parent, I really wish Daisy would look a little more ordinary. Although it's not her fault that she looks good, I only worry about her future. As the night sky covered the surroundings in darkness, the Goldman Mansion's courtyard was brightened up by the lights found around the garden, and the banquet looked extremely boisterous. In addition to Zafir, Daisy had invited Lisa and Safi too. Kennedy brought Sapphire over. Sapphire was already 1 year old and had learned how to walk. She could also babble a few simple words and address others. Maisie picked Sapphire up. Safi, I haven't seen you in a while, and you've learned how to walk. Kennedy laughed along. Indeed, kids grow very quickly. She still needed others to carry her around just a few months ago, but now, she sometimes doesn't even let others pick her up. Auntie. Sapphire called Maisie with her adorable voice, and Maisie could not stop laughing. When Nolan and Helios came back, both of them were stunned. Helios came over and said, "You guys actually organized a Christmas gathering." Maisie replied, "It's Daisy's idea, so whatever that makes them happy." She then put Sapphire down, and Sapphire teetered toward Daisy. Barbara shoved Beatrice into Helios' arms all of a sudden. "Hold her. I'm going to grill some food." After saying so, she ran toward the children and got together with them. Helios could only stand in place and glance at her helplessly. Nolan walked up to Maisie's side and looked at the children. "Why didn't you tell me that Daisy wanted to organize a party earlier? You'd surely arrange everything and pay for everything for Daisy if I were to tell you about this beforehand. You'd definitely reserve a high-end restaurant, wouldn't you?" Maisie looked at him and crossed her arms. "We must encourage the kids to accomplish things on their own, and you can't always solve problems with money. We must do something to develop such good habits in them." Nolan sneered. "My wife is correct. This is my fault. I haven't been thinking about this thoroughly." Daisy taught Zafir how to grill a skewer, but Zafir did not seem to have grilled such food before this, so he looked as if he was fumbling through the skewers frantically. Colton drank his drink and glanced at the two of them from time to time. Thinking that his sister did not care about him as much as she cared about an outsider, he was not very delighted about that. Lisa turned to look at Daisy. "Daisy seems to get along quite well with our senior." Even she could not help but envy Daisy because she would always have someone around her who treated her well. Although the girls in her class did not like her, most of them were just jealous. Daisy had always been really popular among male students. Colton snorted softly. "That idiot gets along with just about everyone, and she's not afraid of being cheated. It used to be no lace, and it's Zafir now. I wonder who it's going to be in the future." Lisa glanced at Colton, and as a bystander, even she could feel that Colton was very protective of his younger sister. Chapter 1284. "Colton, hold on to these for me. The smoke just got into my eyes." Daisy handed the uncooked skewers to Colton, who looked reluctant but grabbed them from her anyway. Barbara picked up a tissue and helped her wipe her eyes, feeling rather helpless and funny. "How did you manage to get so dirty from only grilling a few skewers?" Zafir looked at Colton. "Perhaps I can grill them for her?" "I don't need your help." Colton squatted down and placed the skewers back on the grill. Daisy smacked his head while he was at it. "Don't yell at my guest." He talked back with a cowardly tone. All right, I shouldn't yell." Lisa sat in her seat, stared at the noisy but harmonious scene over at the grill, and looked a little downcast and lonely as if it was a scene that she could not fit into. The Santiago manor looked relatively lonely and still compared to the bustling Goldman mansion. Antonio was away because he had to deal with his company's affairs, so Mrs. Santiago and Pearl were the only ones having dinner at home. Pearl had just eaten 2 mouthfuls of food when she suddenly felt nauseous. She covered her mouth and rushed into the bathroom. "Pearl?" Mrs. Santiago noticed something, and her expression changed slightly. She bent over the toilet bowl's edge, vomited, and then flushed the toilet. As soon as she got up, she saw Mrs. Santiago standing at the door solemnly. "Pearl, how long has it been since your last period?" Pearl was startled for a split second, and she shook her head. Mrs. Santiago knew that she did not remember anything, so it was pointless for her to ask her about that, but it was rather clear to her that her daughter might be pregnant. Pearl has finally gotten rid of all her ties with Tanner, but getting pregnant at this moment is. Karma is really a bitch. She grabbed Pearl. "Pearl, come with me to the hospital for a checkup tomorrow. If you really are pregnant. Just listen to me, and don't let Tanner know about this baby." "Are you saying that I'm pregnant?" Pearl was bewildered. She could not understand how she had gotten pregnant and why her mother had asked her not to let Tanner know about the baby. Mrs. Santiago lowered her head. "Pearl, don't ask so many questions. Just listen to me." She did not want her daughter to have anything to do with Tanner because of this child. She did not want her daughter to get hurt again. The next day, Mrs. Santiago took Pearl to the hospital for a checkup. The results showed that she was 7 weeks pregnant. Pearl was at a loss the moment she saw the test results. "I'm actually pregnant." Sitting on the bench in the corridor, she still could not get around the shocking news. Mrs. Santiago hung up the phone and walked toward her. "Pearl, do you want to keep this child? If you want to keep it, all you need to do is give birth to it. Your father and I can help you to raise it. If such incidents hadn't happened in the first place, I wouldn't allow her to give birth to this child. After all, she hasn't gotten married yet, so how will she be able to get herself married into a good family with a child in the future? But now, I no longer wish for Pearl to get married. If she wants to keep the child, at least the child will be able to accompany her in the future." Pearl looked numb. I don't know, Mom. I'm not prepared for this at all. How did I get pregnant? I really can't remember." Mrs. Santiago hugged her, and her eyes turned bloodshot. "My silly child, just let it be if you really can't remember anything. I'll always be with you." Pearl calmed down a little. She bowed her head, lowered her gaze, and did not speak for a long time. At noon, Tanner came to see Pearl at the Santiago manor and brought her many gifts. Pearl sat absent-mindedly on the couch, and she was not listening to what Tanner said. "Pearl." He called her name softly. Pearl raised her head to look at him, only to see him squatting in front of her, holding the back of her slightly cold hand. "What's wrong, don't you like the gifts?" Chapter 1285. Pearl stared at Tanner and did not utter a single word. "I'm pregnant. But Mom doesn't let me tell Tanner about this." Tanner claimed that he had hurt a woman before this, but he kept apologizing to her. These things were constantly replaying in her mind like a fragmentary video. Even though she could not remember anything, she kept on feeling a sense of heaviness looming within her chest cavity, making it very difficult for her to breathe. "Pearl, what's the matter with you?" Tanner wanted to caress her cheek, but she ducked his hand abruptly. "I feel a little tired. I wish to rest." His hand froze in midair, only a few inches away from her face. But seeing that she had said that, he slowly withdrew his hand and could not help but clench it tightly. After a while, he stood up with a smile. "Then you should go and grab some rest first. I'll come to visit you some other day." When Tanner was leaving the manor, Pearl stared at his back and did not know what to think about. At Basburga's airport, Maisie got out of the car, only to see Sadie walking out of the exit with her luggage. She had not seen Sadie in almost a year, and there were some changes in her appearance. Her hair had gotten longer than before, and her shoulder-length hair was side-parted. She used to look like a tomboy, but she looked like a lady now. Sadie walked up to her. "Ma'am, I've returned." "Welcome back." Maisie was about to grab Sadie's luggage from her when she immediately stopped her. "Ma'am, I'll do it myself." She neatly placed her luggage in the trunk and then got into the car with Maisie. Maisie asked Sadie about her parents while they were in the car, and Sadie kept quiet for a short moment before explaining, "They built a new family. I've gotten used to wandering around freely, so living with them doesn't suit my lifestyle much." Her parents now had 4 children and had long forgotten about the child they had abandoned. What her sudden appearance had brought to them was not a pleasant surprise, but enormous pressure. In the past, she could not get over the reason her parents would abandon her cruelly. She did not know why until she met her parents in person. It was because her parents had suffered to raise all their children, so they could only sell her to another party for the living expenses that they desperately needed. Reuniting with the child they had sold back then had only made things and emotions complicated within the family. Maisie looked at her. "It doesn't matter. The Goldman mansion will be your home from now on. You can stay here and continue to live with us." Sadie nodded and said seriously, "I'll stay by your side wherever you go in the future. I'll be loyal to you and only you for the rest of my life." Maisie lifted her hand to stroke her hair and could not help but laugh out loud. "Let's just forget about the being loyal to only me for the rest of your life part. You still have to get married in the future." "I won't get married." Seeing that Sadie had suddenly gotten serious, Maisie stopped teasing her. "Okay, no matter what you want to do, just do it. I'll support you wholeheartedly." Maisie took Sadie back to the Goldman mansion. Quincy just so happened to come downstairs and saw the person beside Maisie, who looked a little familiar to him. "Mrs. Goldman, this is... You've forgotten about her so soon?" Maisie smiled. Quincy took a closer look at the person, and the familiar poker face finally reminded him who it was. "Is this Sadie?" Quincy was very surprised. "Wow, that's rare. Miss Sadie, you've grown your hair. Have you made up your mind to quit being a tomboy?" Sadie gazed at him calmly. The intensity and ferocity of her glare had not fallen behind after spending all that time away from the field, causing Quincy to make a wise choice to shut up immediately. Maisie patted him on the shoulder. "Would you like to dance a little with Sadie in the practice room?" Quincy gave off an awkward smile. "No, there's no need for that. Love and peace have always been my life motto." Maisie shook her head and went upstairs to find Nolan. Nolan was in the study, reading a magazine, and he raised his gaze when he heard footsteps approaching. "Have you fetched Sadie back?" "Yeah." She turned around, sat on his thigh, and wrapped her arms around his neck. "She'll stay in the Goldman mansion from now on. Will that be fine?" Chapter 1286. Nolan smiled and grabbed her by her waist. "You're the lady of the house here, but you can't make a decision?" Maisie leaned in half an inch. "I'm discussing with you, the lord of the house." Nolan carried her to the table and put his hands behind her on the table. He then put his lips close to her cheeks. "Our discussions would be more fruitful at night." Maisie chuckled and put a finger to his lips. "That's not a discussion. That's a transaction." He laughed. "Transactions are so old-fashioned." He then buried his face on her neck, brushing his lips against her skin. "That's part of the fun." Maisie felt ticklish, so she escaped. "You're so naughty even during the daytime." He kissed her lips. "Ever since I met you, I've forgotten what not being naughty means." His hand slowly unbuttoned her clothes. At that moment, there was the sound of shattered china downstairs. Maisie immediately pushed him away and tidied up her clothes. "What was that?" Nolan hugged her. Don't leave me hanging right now." He kissed her again, but Maisie put her palm to his lips. "Sadie is waiting for me downstairs. I can't keep her waiting." After that, she smiled and escaped. Nolan tugged on his tie to release some heat. Maisie walked downstairs. What happened here? She saw the shattered vase on the floor and Quincy picking up the pieces. He jerked when he heard Maisie's voice and slowly looked up. "Mrs. Goldman." Maisie looked at Quincy and Sadie. Before she could speak, Nolan's voice echoed. "That vase was passed down from Elder Master Goldman. It's worth $4,500,000. Quincy immediately raised his arms when he heard that number. Mr. Goldman, I swear that this was just an accident, Sadie suddenly pointed at him. I saw it, he broke it. Quincy looked at her in shock, because that was an utter lie. He hadn't broken it, she had. He immediately stood up. Mr. Goldman, it really wasn't. We'll take it out of your salary. Nolan looked at him with no emotions. That was for interrupting him. Quincy stood there like he was a statue. Maisie couldn't help but laugh when she walked to Sadie. Go pack your bags. Sadie nodded and looked toward Quincy when she pulled a face. Quincy almost fainted from anger. That was too much. Mr. Goldman, look at her. Quincy wanted to complain, but Nolan looked mischievous. Can't even handle a woman. Quincy was rendered speechless. A few days later, Maisie walked past the study and heard Quincy's voice. I heard that Antonio Santiago has left the board of La Perla and has handed his shares to the deputy director. I think the Santiagos are going to migrate to another country. Nolan closed his file and put it on the desk. That's a loss. Maisie entered the room, and the two men looked at her simultaneously. When was that? Quincy replied, 2 days ago. It's in the news. Antonio announced that he was leaving the board of directors of La Perla and handed the position to his friend. Maisie raised her eyebrow. Why are they migrating out of the blue? Who knows? Quincy shrugged. Maybe they just needed a new environment. Antonio has been working his entire life, so I guess he's retiring earlier. After Quincy left, Nolan stretched his hand, brought her over to him, and stared at her. What's wrong? Chapter 1287. Maisie shook her head and sat on his lap. I just think that it's a waste. Antonio Santiago is quite a big name in the jewelry industry. He founded La Perla over 30 years ago and thought that he would be able to pass it to his daughter, but he probably never thought that it would go to someone else. He pushed her hair behind her. Maybe Antonio knew that he had had a good run, but he didn't teach or spend enough time with his daughter. After what happened, fame and fortune are no longer as important as family. Maisie paused and stared at Nolan. If it was Daisy, would you? Yes. Nolan lowered his head and kissed her forehead, then leaned in closer to her. I can give up fame and fortune as long as I have you. Her eyes welled up. She looked down and smiled when Nolan pulled her into a hug and kissed the top of her head. At the same time, at the Santiagos. Mrs. Santiago finished packing her bags when she went into the study. She saw her husband standing in front of the photo frames on the bookshelf. His parents, his baby, their wedding, and Pearl's pictures had all been taken in this house. Honey, if you can't get yourself to do it, why don't? No. Antonio turned around and faced her. We can leave once everything is packed. We're not leaving forever. Mrs. Santiago's eyes welled up, but she smiled. That's true. Let's just spend New Year's overseas this year. The car slowly drove into the airport. Pearl and her mother sat in the back seat while she looked out the window. The passing scenery was like scenes from a movie. Kamala held her hand. Pearl, once we're overseas, I'll find the best doctor to work on your face, so don't worry about it. Pearl turned to face her, smiled, and nodded. On the other side, Tanner sped to the airport when he found out that Pearl was leaving. He parked his car at the entrance to the airport and ran into the departure hall, searching for Pearl among the crowd. He picked up his phone, but her phone was switched off. He dropped his arm, so anxious that he almost broke down. Pearl sat in the departure hall with a hat on. Her hair covered the gauze on her face. She put her hand on her belly, deep in thought. When the announcement to board the flight was made, Kamala picked up her luggage bag. Let's go. We need to board. Pearl nodded and followed her parents to the gate. They missed each other just like parallel lines. After 2 months, Maisie arranged for everyone at Seoul to go on a break the day before New Year's. They all left by noon, but she left after clearing up her work. When she was closing her door, she saw Kennedy walking over. "Uncle Kendi, why are you still here?" Kennedy was bummed. "I left my bag in the office and returned to pick it up." He looked at her. "You asked everyone to leave, but you stayed to work instead." She smiled. "I'm the owner, so I have to be responsible. By the way, Uncle Kennedy, bring Aunt Samantha over for dinner with us on New Year's." She walked toward Nolan, who was waiting outside his car after getting out of the office building. He was in a suit and black coat but didn't have a tie on, and his collar was unbuttoned. She walked over. "Why didn't you wait in the car?" Chapter 1288. Nolan put out his arm and pulled her in. "Because I want to hug you." She laughed and flattened his collar with her hand. "It's still early. I'd like to go somewhere before we go home." Nolan nodded and held her hand. "I'll go with you." Maisie bought 2 bouquets of white roses from the florist and slowly drove into the graveyard. She walked to her parents' graves with the bouquets. "Dad, Mom, another year has passed. I used to hate New Year's because I didn't belong in that family, but not anymore. I'm a mother now, and I have a husband who loves me, so you don't need to worry about me anymore." Maisie looked down, took a deep breath to keep her tears back, and smiled at the photos. On the way back, Maisie leaned on Nolan's shoulder while he put his arms around her and kissed the top of her head. The car parked in front of the mansion and Daisy's voice could be heard right after Maisie got out of the vehicle. "Mommy, Waylon, and Grandpa are back." She trotted over, jumped into her arms, and happily looked up. "Are you surprised?" Maisie laughed and pinched her nose. "I knew it already." Daisy pouted. Waylon and Yorick walked into the yard. Maisie and Nolan were both surprised when they saw Yorick. Yorick patted Waylon's head and raised his eyebrows at them. "What? Are you surprised to see me with your son?" Nolan laughed. "You're just here for the free meal." Maisie squinted. If Yorick was here, Madame Hathaway and Zyla were probably there. As expected, Madame Hathaway was having a good chat with her grandchildren in the living room with Zyla sitting next to her. "Nolan, Maisie, you're back." Nicholas put down his teacup. Maisie walked to Madame Hathaway and smiled. "We meet again, ma'am." Nolan whispered into her ear, "You should call her Grandma." Maisie paused. Madame Hathaway chuckled. "It's all right, that's not important. I'm not married to that old man. I prefer ma'am." Maisie felt awkward. Nicholas walked over with his Crane and Quincy. "You're still our family." Madame Hathaway picked up her teacup and calmly said, "I looked forward to it when I was younger, but not anymore. I'm glad I wasn't married to that old thing." Titus, who usually had a hot temper, only kept quiet. It seemed that only Madame Hathaway was able to control him. On New Year's Eve, they all sat together for dinner along with Quincy and Sadie. It was a lively event. Waylon peeled some prawns for his sister, and Colton looked at him. "You're spoiling her again." Daisy stuck her tongue out at him. Waylon was helpless. "You can't win an argument against her." Colton tried not to laugh. Daisy heard something and turned to look at him. "You're joking." Madame Hathaway couldn't help but smile while watching their interaction. Nolan and Maisie's children are so energetic. Titus handed her some food. Daisy is the talkative one. Colton and Waylon are more like Nolan. Titus said, "If you love children, get Yorick and Zyla to make some." Zyla was surprised, then looked toward Yorick, who smiled. "We're taking our time." Chapter 1289. Nolan calmly added, "There really isn't a reason to be anxious for an old man who runs around a lot." Yorick smiled amicably while everyone laughed. When they heard the sound of fireworks, Daisy put down her cutlery. "Waylon, Colton, hurry up. It's time for fireworks." The children moved the fireworks to the door, and Quincy helped them set them on fire. The moment the fireworks shot upward, the children laughed happily. Maisie stood in the yard and watched the fireworks go off, then looked back at Nolan, who was looking at her. There were no lights in the home. Tanner looked out the window. The busy city streets looked lonely, just like his heart. He took out his phone, and he had no idea when he had set Pearl's photo as the lock screen wallpaper. It had been 2 months since she left him. When he heard the doorbell, Tanner slowly walked to the door and saw that Mrs. Hannigan was outside. "Tan, come home. Your father is waiting for you." After a long time, Tanner looked at the dark room and said, "I'll go back later." Mrs. Hannigan nodded. She turned to leave, but Tanner suddenly said, "Mom." Mrs. Hannigan paused and turned around to look at him in surprise. "What? Did you call me?" Ever since marrying Nathaniel, Tanner had never called her mom. She knew that she was just a stepmother, and it was understandable that he didn't accept her. But now that she heard him call her, she was overwhelmed with emotions. He added, "Thanks for taking care of Dad all this while." Tanner had been under the impression that Mrs. Hannigan had married his father because of the money and the status of Mrs. Hannigan, but after his father fell sick, she never left him and instead took care of him without complaint. One needed to see people during their best and worst times to know who they really were, and that was something that Pearl had taught him. Mrs. Hannigan's eyes welled up. "Come home." Tanner went in and packed up some clothes. A diary fell to the floor when he opened up one of the drawers. He paused, then picked it up, not remembering that he had a diary. A thought suddenly came to his mind, so he pulled up a chair and opened the diary, recognizing the handwriting. It was Pearl's. "He was so weird, treating me hot and cold. I knew that he didn't really love me, but I would believe him when he treated me too nicely. I turned him down when he asked me out, and he seemed to be angry. I didn't want to say no at first, but I felt that there wasn't a need for that. It was all fake, and I don't want more problems. It's my birthday today, and I asked him to have dinner with me because I wanted to spend time with him, but he hung up on me. Never mind, happy birthday to me, he's with another woman. Does he love her? I wish that I could forget what I saw. Why did that have to happen? I feel horrible. I'm tired and want to leave him. I want to end this marriage. Why wouldn't he accept the breakup? Why would he want to tie me down when he doesn't love me? I'm suffering. Why is he so cruel to me? I will never forget how he judged me and his actions. It would be great if I could lose my memory." Tanner's eyes blurred after reading that, and the tears that fell dampened the paper. His heart started aching while he put his hand to his forehead and laughed as his tears rolled. Chapter 1290. If only Tanner could have a do-over, but unfortunately, he couldn't. Meanwhile, at Morwich, Pearl sat in her hospital room while the doctor removed the gauze wrapped around her face, and the nurse placed a mirror in front of her. She looked at the unfamiliar face that had undergone 2 surgeries and was badly swollen. The doctor told her, "Ms. Santiago, avoid rubbing your face within the next half a year for optimum recovery." Pearl smiled. "Thank you." After the doctor walked out, Pearl looked at herself in the mirror and smiled. She would be able to leave her past behind from now on. 3 years later. The media congratulated Seoul for getting into the top 6 listed companies in the country. They were only second to the big Taylor jewelry, becoming the second biggest international jewelry brand. The jewelry industry was closely related to the fashion industry. Seoul had started off by creating custom-made jewelry and had moved on to high-end custom-made, a great improvement. Maisie took her first interview with reporters, and someone asked, "Madam, when you first started Seoul, why didn't you use your already famous identity of Zora to get more success?" Maisie was quiet for a while, before smiling and answering, "To me, Zora was my past. I might be able to create more demand than Zora, but in my mind, Zora and I are 2 separate entities. Zora would limit me because people would have high expectations already, so if I failed, the glory that Zora had would be tainted. I don't see starting as a beginner as a problem because I want to create a new brand. If an amateur failed, I would at least not be bound by glory and could just bounce back. If I succeeded as Zora, people would only know that name, not Maisie Vanderbilt. After the interview, Sadie helped Maisie walk down the stage when the latter suddenly stopped, bent down, and removed her heels. Sadie immediately took out a box of flats. When Maisie put them on, she quietly said, "If I knew that the interview would go on for so long, I wouldn't have worn heels." They both walked out of the elevator and saw Nolan's car parked not too far away. Nolan walked out of the car, and she ran to him, jumping into his arms. He took 2 steps back because of the sudden momentum, put his hand to the back of her head so that her face was buried in his chest, and smiled. "What's wrong?" "I missed you." Maisie looked up at him, her face still as beautiful as ever. She didn't look like she was in her 30s. Nolan chuckled as he carried her into the car and tapped her nose. "You're a 30-year-old acting like a child." Maisie hugged his neck. "Only when I'm with you." Other than taking good care of their skin, women in their 30s needed to have a good state of mind. She could be a child when her husband loved her so much. As the car slowly drove toward the Goldman mansion, Maisie saw the billboards and advertising boards with Soul plastered all over, and she was content.